If you were looking for an automotive metaphor that told you all that was good and bad about the British car industry over the last 5 decades, you could do a lot worse than look at this, the Jaguar XJ40. We thought we'd take a drive in this early Daimler version to see what it's like to drive today and really understand what was so good and bad about the British car industry.
But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition.
So to say that the XJ40 was eagerly anticipated would be something of an understatement. It was unveiled at the Paris Motor Show in 1986. Some 14 years after the initial version was first conceived. Thoughts of replacing the XJ6 actually started in 1972, but of course the 1970s were not a happy time for the British car industry. Jaguar was part of British Leyland by then, and of course British Leyland itself went bankrupt in 1975. And before that, Sir William Lyons and his chief wingman Lofty England had both retired, leaving experienced engineer Bob Knight to fight for Jaguar's honour in the troubled days of British Leyland. All throughout that turbulent period, the XJ40's development was put on hold or certainly delayed. By the time Michael Edwards was installed as the boss of BL in 1977, the XJ40 project was given the green light again, and the intention was to put it on sale by 1983. By the turn of the 80s though, new Jaguar boss John Egan and indeed their chief tester Norman Jewis were convinced that the XJ40 wasn't going to be ready for 1983. They really wanted to spend more time doing further research and development on the car to ensure that it was reliable and dependable. Remember, it had to go against some pretty stiff opposition from the Germans in the form of the BMW 7 Series and the Mercedes S-Class. So it was finally introduced in 1986. Reception was largely a positive one. Motoring journalists at the time praised it for the way it rode and the way it handled. Autocar at the time commented that the styling was very similar to the predecessor, the Series 3, but I disagree with that. I think the XJ40's more chiselled, angular look is actually far better. It's aged very well. I think the XJ40's got really elegant proportions, and I defy anyone to not appreciate the elegant, simple profile of the XJ40. It's just gorgeous. It was also a technical tour de force. The aging XK power plant was replaced by the AJ6 engine in 2.9 and 3.6 guises, and of course that version had seen the light of day under the bonnet of the XJS from 83, so it had 2 or 3 years for Jaguar to really get to grips with building that engine reliably. And it's a really good unit. It's much lighter than the XK, more powerful, it's smoother and it's more economical. It used largely the same suspension as the Series 3, but they spent a lot of time making sure that it was mounted to the body in a slightly different way to ensure less vibration and harshness back into the cabin. And the ride is superb. It's firmer than the Series 3. With that also comes better handling, and the journalists of the day really praised it for that. The XJ40 also had effectively the forerunner to what is today's modern multiplex wiring. It's got over 200 electronic components in this car, effectively monitoring all elements of the way the car functions. And Jaguar dealers had to buy a really expensive piece of kit to ensure they could service and maintain these cars, because it had effectively one of the first Jaguar diagnostic systems. The interior is very traditional. It's still got lots of wood, lots of leather, but the technology is never that far away. On these really early examples, you've got this interior instrumentation that's traditional speedo and rev counter, and then loads of electronics. It was kind of nicknamed Tokyo by night. I'm not sure it was to everyone's taste. It's certainly very 1980s when you look at it, lots of digital gauges and everything. But it's quite telling that come the 1990 facelift, they abandoned it back for traditional 2 main gauges and 4 auxiliary ones. Price-wise, it was pitched pretty much perfectly. You could buy a sort of fairly basic spec 2.9 for well under £20,000, and that put it firmly against the Rover 800 and other bread and butter executive saloons of the day. The XJ40 Sovereign was around the £20,000 mark, which made it much better value than the equivalent E32 7 Series or indeed Mercedes S-Class, while the Daimler topped out at about £28,000, which really put it at the top of the tree, but it was still remarkably good value. An E32 735 would have been about £25,000, but with a lot less kit on it. The Daimler is absolutely top of the range. You've got the picnic tables, you've got the lamb's wool rugs, beautiful leather interior. It's just got the lot you wouldn't want for any luxuries in here at all. And from the outset, it sold really well. It didn't sell too many in its launch year, but that's understandable. But 1987 and 1988 were really good years for Jaguar. Over those 2 years, they sold nearly 80,000 of these XJ40s. And come 1989, Jaguar had one of its best years in terms of sales in its history. The trouble, I suppose, really is that despite all the effort to make the XJ40 more reliable, it did get let down by some of those electronics. That did blight the reputation of Jaguar somewhat, and there were still those that fondly regarded the Series 3 model. They preferred its more traditional styling. So the XJ40 did have a tough time. It also had the encroaching rivalry from the likes of the BMW E32 7 Series and the Mercedes S-Class, and they had a new threat from Toyota's luxury arm Lexus. Of course, introduced the LS400, definitely gave Jaguar a run for its money. So the XJ40 had its work cut out. Come 1990, however, Jaguar was now in the hands of Ford, and a facelift for the XJ40 was announced in 1990, which upgraded the 2.9 engine to 3.2, and the 3.6 came 4 litres. A lot of the electronic gremlins that had troubled some of those early cars had largely been fixed by the facelift as well. And as was the case with a lot of Jaguars, they steadily got better. The V12 model was introduced in 1993 after some substantial re-engineering work that had to take place for the engine bay to fit the V format engine, and twin airbags were introduced in that year as well. And then, of course, by 1994, the X300 came out, which was arguably the XJ40 that should have been. The X300 really is a high point, really, of the Ford-Jaguar partnership. But the XJ40, remember, started life while Jaguar was still in the hands of British Leyland. It transcended Jaguar's time into private ownership and subsequent Ford takeover. So it spans an incredibly important time in Jaguar's history. And despite its difficulties, it was a brilliant car. It had all the right developments to really modernise the XJ line. I suppose it's a pity it didn't come out a little bit earlier. Had it come out in the early 80s as it was meant to, it would have arguably stolen a march on all of its competitors. I'm a real sucker for XJ40s. I've had 3 of them. They're just really good to drive. The AJ6 engine is really smooth, the ride is supple, the handling is good, it's refined, it's comfortable. The only criticism you can really level at it is that for such a large car it's relatively cramped, the steering's a little bit light, and the brakes are a little bit dead to feel. But for just cruising along, wafting along, the XJ40 is as good as any other generation XJ. And while some people don't like that square styling, I personally love it. So, does it represent the very best and worst of the British car industry? Well, yes, I think it does. It represents the very worst simply because it's another car loaded with what might have beens. What if it had been brought out on time in the early 80s? What if it had been that little bit more reliable and dependable? But also it represents the very best of the British car industry. For Jaguar, it's an absolute symbol of its tenacity, its ingenuity, the sheer brilliance of the people at Browns Lane to develop a car with all of this technology on a fraction of the budget compared to its German competitors. The XJ40 really is that testimony to what you can achieve sometimes with very little. It's a fabulous car, and of course what came after it proves that they were on the right lines. It just needed a little bit more time and probably a little bit more budget. So if you want an underdog that's more like a top cat, the XJ40 should be on your list.
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.